Berlin, 1962. The most dangerous border on the planet. A concrete wasteland of landmines, guard dogs, and soldiers with orders to kill on sight. But to understand what happened here, you need to go back further. You need to understand the world that made this wall necessary. After World War II, Germany was carved up like a carcass. For powers, for sectors, one broken city. The Americans, the British, the French, they built something in the West. Imperfect, messy, but alive. The Soviets built something different in the East. They built a system that treated human beings as variables in an equation. Resources to be managed, mouths to be fed just enough, minds to be controlled absolutely. By 1952, the borders between East and West Germany were sealed with barbed wire and watchtowers. But Berlin was different. Berlin was a wound that wouldn't close. Because inside the city, you could still walk from east to west. You could still choose. And that terrified the men in Moscow. Between 1949 and 1961, 3 million people walked out of East Germany. 3 million. Doctors, engineers, teachers, scientists. The intellectual bloodstream of an entire nation, draining westward, one suitcase at a time. The East German economy was hemorrhaging. The communist experiment was failing not because of bombs or armies. It was failing because, given a choice, people left. So on the night of August 12, 1961, Walter Ulbricht, the gray, humorless man who ran East Germany, gave an order. And by morning, the city had a scar running through its heart. The Berlin Wall. Not built to keep enemies out. Built to keep citizens in. That distinction matters. That distinction tells you everything. The East German Stasi believed they had built a perfect cage. A wall that didn't just divide a city, but erased hope. But concrete alone was never enough for men like Erich Mielke. Mielke was the head of the Stasi from 1957 to 1989. He was not a dramatic villain. He was something worse. He was bureaucratic. He approached human surveillance with the same cold efficiency a factory manager might apply to production quotas. Under his leadership, the Stasi became the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus in human history. At its peak, the Stasi employed 91,000 full-time officers. That's one officer for every 63 citizens of East Germany. But the full-time officers were just the tip of the iceberg. The informal collaborators, the informants, numbered 189,000. One informant for every 6 citizens. Your neighbor, your teacher, maybe even your own father. They had a word for it. Zersitzung. Decomposition. The systematic psychological destruction of anyone who posed a threat to the state. They wouldn't just arrest you. They would move your furniture 2 inches to the left while you slept. They would open your mail, read it, reseal it perfectly. They would leave subtle signs in your apartment that someone had been there, but leave no proof. The goal wasn't just to control. It was to make you doubt your own mind. To make you wonder if you were paranoid. If you were going insane. Because a man who doubts his own sanity cannot organize a resistance. The Stasi spent millions of marks perfecting the death strip. Tanks, barbed wire, and the Sperrtor, the signal fences that alerted a guard the second a blade of grass moved. They had sensors in the ground. They had microphones in the walls. They had the most sophisticated surveillance network in the Eastern Bloc. The border was a masterpiece of intimidation. The Stasi generals slept soundly. They believed the physics of the wall were absolute. Concrete, steel, terror. The mathematics of escape had been solved. The answer was 0. But the Stasi made one fatal mistake. They believed that power comes from the top down. They forgot that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a missile or a spy satellite. It's a human being who has nothing left to lose. Meet Hans. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a trained operative of the CIA. He was a man who liked jazz, read poetry, and worked a desk job that bored him to tears. But Hans had watched 3 of his friends disappear. Not dramatically, not in handcuffs or in the middle of the night with sirens. They simply stopped being there. A Monday morning, an empty chair, an unanswered knock. The Stasi didn't need dramatic arrests. Dramatic arrests created martyrs. They preferred erasure. Hans understood, with the quiet clarity that only genuine fear can produce, that he was next. He had attended the wrong meeting, borrowed the wrong book, been seen talking to the wrong person. In the logic of the Stasi, that was enough. He had a choice. Wait to be erased. Or dig. The plan was madness. Pure, unadulterated madness. To dig a tunnel under the death strip was not just a risk. It was a suicide mission. One wrong move, one collapse, one accidental noise, and you wouldn't be arrested. You would simply disappear. Hans and his small circle of collaborators weren't engineers. They were desperate. They worked in a basement, beneath a laundry room, in a house that the Stasi had already flagged as suspicious. Every single scoop of earth was a gamble. Think about the physics of it. The dirt in Berlin is heavy. It's damp. It wants to collapse. This isn't metaphor. This is geology. The Berlin soil is a mix of glacial sand and clay deposited during the last ice age. It has a terrifying tendency to shift when disturbed. Professional mining crews with industrial equipment had to plan meticulously to work in it safely. Hans had wooden planks salvaged from old crates. He had buckets. And he had the spoon. The tunnel had to be long enough to clear the death strip, a minimum of 130 meters in their location. Every inch of progress took hours. They worked in shifts. 2 men in the tunnel, 2 men moving earth in the basement, 1 man on watch. The earth they removed had to go somewhere. They hid it in suitcases, in boxes, in the gaps between walls. They moved it at night, in small amounts, to different locations around the neighborhood. If anyone noticed the amount of soil they were displacing, it was over. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone and rotting organic matter. Oxygen was a luxury. They had to rig a makeshift ventilation system, a thin pipe that leaked air into the basement, hoping the neighbors wouldn't smell the damp earth rising from the floorboards. At one point, roughly 40 meters in, the tunnel began to fill with groundwater. Quietly, slowly, with no drama. Just cold water seeping through the walls, rising around their knees in the dark. They spent 4 days bailing it out with cooking pots. They sealed the breach with tar and prayer. And they kept going. The psychological torture was the real enemy. Not the Stasi. Not the physics of the earth. The weight. The sensation of the weight is what special operations psychologists call the most destructive force in covert work. Not the action. Not the danger. The anticipation. Imagine lying flat on your stomach in a hole no wider than a coffin. The walls press against your shoulders on both sides. The ceiling is 6 inches from your face. You can hear your own heartbeat thumping in your ears. You can feel every minute of the 6 months of work in your back, your hands, your lungs. And then, you hear it. Boots. Above you. A Stasi patrol, walking directly overhead. In that moment, the world shrinks. The entire Cold War, the nuclear missiles, the geopolitical treaties, the superpower rivalry, it all disappears. The only thing that matters in the universe is the 3 feet of dirt between you and a Stasi guard's boot. If you breathe too loud, you die. If you cough, you die. If the spoon slips and hits a rock, you die. The boots pass. Silence. You wait another 40 seconds, your heart doing things hearts were not designed to do. And then you pick up the spoon again. This was the special op. No parachutes. No silenced pistols. No midnight drops from a C-130. Just a man, a spoon, and a level of terror that would break most professional soldiers. While Hans was bleeding in the dirt, the Stasi were celebrating. They had just installed a new series of seismic sensors. These devices were designed to pick up the slightest vibration in the earth. A footstep, a heartbeat, a shovel. The technology had come, in part, from Soviet research programs originally designed to detect underground nuclear tests. They had repurposed tools built to find atomic detonations, to catch individual human beings. The Stasi general, Oberst Klaus Richter, in his polished uniform, at his polished desk, believed he had finally achieved what he called Total Grenzsicherheit, total border integrity. He had spent millions of marks on German and Soviet electronics. He had the best engineers in the Eastern Bloc calculating the frequency of the soil. He presented his findings to the Central Committee with the confidence of a man who had, in his mind, solved a mathematical problem, the problem of human freedom. He believed he had solved it. He had not. This is the ratio of incompetence. On one side, a billion-dollar surveillance state, powered by the most feared secret police in history, armed with technology derived from the nuclear age. On the other side, a man with a piece of kitchenware. The Stasi were looking for the vibration of an industrial drill. They were listening for the sound of a professional mining operation. Their sensors were calibrated for threats they could imagine. And this is the fatal arrogance of all systems of control. They can only defend against what they have conceived of. They were so obsessed with high-tech threats that they forgot the most basic rule of espionage, first articulated not in any intelligence manual, but in the simple arithmetic of history. The most effective weapon is the one you don't think to look for. You don't look for a spoon. A spoon produces vibrations below the threshold of their sensors. A spoon moves Earth so slowly that the soil pressure changes are indistinguishable from natural settling. A spoon is, in the language of surveillance systems, invisible. The multi-million mark detection network, the pride of the Eastern Bloc's border security apparatus, had a hole in it the exact size of a dessert spoon. The moment of truth had arrived. 6 months after the first scoop of Earth, the tunnel had reached the other side. But they weren't out yet. They were in the no man's land, the narrow, terrifying gap between the tunnel exit and the western border. Hans climbed out into the rain. Beside him, for other men, they were ghosts. Gray, shaking, covered in the filth of 6 months of digging. Their hands were ruined, fingernails black, palms calloused and cracked. Their eyes had the specific look of people who have spent too long in the dark. The plan was simple. Get the fugitives through the hole and across the line before the guards noticed the missing Earth. Simple. Not easy. But the Stasi are not known for their patience. They are known for their cruelty. The spotlight hit them. Somewhere on the western side, a voice began shouting, encouraging them. Run, run. The perfect border had been breached. The Stasi guards didn't even understand what they were seeing. They didn't see a professional army. They didn't see a CIA strike team. They saw 5 mud-covered men emerging from a hole in the ground like moles. Like moles. The most feared border in the world, defeated by something found in a kitchen drawer. For 3 minutes, the world held its breath. The guards were confused. Doctrine had no provision for this. The fugitives ran. The total border integrity had been shattered by a hole in the dirt. The escape was a chaos of screams and gunfire. But the fugitives made it. They crossed the line. They felt the touch of Western soil beneath their boots. When Oberst Richter arrived at the scene, he didn't find high-tech equipment. He didn't find blueprints or radio transmitters or the fingerprints of a foreign intelligence service. He found the spoon. He stood there, in his polished boots and ironed uniform, staring at a piece of cutlery lying in the dirt of the death strip. There are reports, never officially confirmed, that he didn't speak for nearly 2 minutes. He simply looked at it. $1 billion surveillance state. The most feared secret police in Europe. The technology of the nuclear age. The informant network. The sensors. The dogs. The spotlights. Outsmarted by a man who used a kitchen tool to bankrupt their reputation. This wasn't just a jailbreak. It was a philosophical failure of the highest order. The Stasi had built their entire identity on the premise that the state was omniscient. That it saw everything, knew everything, could stop everything. The spoon proved that premise false. And once a totalitarian system's myth of invincibility is broken, it begins the long, slow process of dying. The wall would stand for another 27 years. But something had shifted. The mathematics had changed. If one man with a spoon could breach total border integrity, what else was possible? Hans didn't become a general. He didn't get a medal from the president. There was no press conference, no book deal, no documentary. He simply disappeared into the West. He spent the next 40 years living an ordinary life. He worked in a bookstore in a city in West Germany that I will not name, because some details are still worth protecting. He married. He raised a family. He grew old. He watched the moon landing on a small television in a rented apartment. He watched Nixon resign. He watched the Shah fall, and Saigon fall, and the Soviet Union itself fall, piece by piece, like a building whose foundation had always been hollow. He grew old in a world where the wall he had defied was now just a tourist attraction. His children never knew that their father had once been the most hunted man in East Germany. They never knew that the man who forgot to take out the trash sometimes was the same man who had humiliated the Stasi with a spoon. The greatest victory of the operation wasn't the escape itself. It was the silence. The ability to live a life where you are no longer a target, where you are no longer a threat, or a fugitive, or a symbol, where you are just a man. Ordinary, invisible, free. There is something profound in that. The men who escape history often vanish from it entirely. We celebrate the monuments and the speeches, the dramatic moments. We forget that for most people who do brave things, the bravery is followed not by glory, but by the enormous, beautiful relief of ordinary life. Of boring Tuesdays, of grocery lists, of children who complain about homework. Hans earned his Tuesday mornings. He paid for them in dirt and terror and 6 months of a spoon. The wall fell in November 1989. Not with a war, not with an army, with crowds of people who had finally stopped being afraid. The Stasi files were burned in frantic bonfires as the regime collapsed, officers destroying decades of surveillance records, the evidence of their crimes going up in smoke. But they couldn't burn everything. Enough survived. We know now the scale of what they built, the names of the informants, the techniques of Zersitzung, the full, documented architecture of a state that treated its citizens as livestock. We know it because the files survived, and some stories survive in other ways. Somewhere, in a dusty attic in Berlin, there is a rusted metal spoon. Not in a museum, not behind glass, just somewhere. The only artifact of an operation that the Stasi never officially acknowledged. Because to acknowledge it would be to admit what the spoon proved. That no matter how high you build your walls, no matter how much money you spend on sensors and informants and fences, no matter how sophisticated your system of control, someone, somewhere, is always digging. The spoon doesn't remember ideology. It doesn't remember sides. It only remembers the truth that every system of power eventually forgets. That a human being who wants to be free is more persistent than any wall ever built to stop them. And that truth, that simple, inconvenient, unkillable truth, is the one thing no surveillance state has ever successfully buried.